Taoiseach, the public outcry this week from parents, SNAs, principals and teachers has demonstrated the level of fear and distress created by your government with your crude approach to SNA allocations. We've all been reminded this week about the vital work that SNAs do in our schools. To the children who need them, they are indispensable. One mother wrote to me yesterday. She said, "My daughter feels safe with her SNA by her side. I honestly don't know where we would be without that help. No teacher, no matter how dedicated, can meet every complex need alone." Another email that you also received, Taoiseach, asked you bluntly, have you any idea what it's like to be a teacher or an SNA in a classroom in 2026? Along with sustained underfunding of schools, these people are bearing the brunt of the Irish government's failures. And Taoiseach, she's right to say this, because your government is failing school communities. I've seen the NCSE letter sent to many school principals last week, abruptly informing them of the impact of the government review. In one letter dated 10th February that I've seen, the principal was told that a surplus of 3 SNA posts has been identified in your school. So without any prior warning, this principal will find themselves with a near 50% reduction in SNA supports for this coming school year. And many more principals received similar letters. No wonder there was an outcry at what amounted to a cut in SNA allocation for so many schools. Sensibly, yesterday you paused your review in a last-minute U-turn. But Taoiseach, a pause is not a plan, and we need clarity on what happens next. As my colleague Deputy Owen Kenny has said, any change in allocation process must be phased in, and new supports must be put in place before existing lifelines are taken away. Instead, the Department of Education's way, it seems, is to strip supports before new ones exist, while children are still waiting years for assessments. Of course, SNAs have to be allocated correctly, but many schools are struggling with large class sizes and limited resources to support children with complex needs. And every week I hear from principals fearful they cannot provide for those pupils' needs. Every week I hear from teachers and SNAs, we all do, struggling to cope in the classroom. Every week we hear from exhausted parents, desperately fighting for a school place or indeed for supports for their child. And of course it's children who bear the brunt, waiting years and years for an assessment or diagnosis, years spent without appropriate supports. So the current practice of your government had allowed children who hadn't yet received a diagnosis to avail of the help of an SNA. And that practice, as we know, was plugging the gap of the scandalous waiting lists for assessments of need, a list that you failed to clear. So now a national increase in SNA numbers offers little reassurance if individual schools are losing posts and children losing support. Because when you remove an SNA from a mainstream classroom, a child suffers. It's as simple as that. So Taoiseach, 2 questions for you. Will you clarify what yesterday's announcement of a pause actually means for schools? And will you apologise to schools, parents and school communities for the shock news of SNA cuts that so many received last year?
Taoiseach to respond.
First of all, Deputy, I think we need to have some degree of objective assessment of what actually has happened in terms of investment in education. Investment in education has increased dramatically over the last number of years. Of that, there is no question. Just go through the number of extra teachers in our education system over the last number of years. Quite significant. We have had sustained reduction in pupil-teacher ratios over the last number of years. We've had record increases in capitation grants to schools, most recently in the last budget. In terms of special needs assistance, in 2020 there were 16,000 SNAs in our schools. In 2021 that went to 18,000. In 2022 it went to 19,000. In 2023 it went to 21,000 SNAs in our schools. In 2024 close to 22,000 in our schools. In 2025 23,000, and by September of the next school year, it will be 25,000. That's not cuts. That's not reduction in expenditure in education. That is expansion, and that is increase. So could we at least agree that? The issue then becomes the deployment of those special needs assistance to the children most in need. And so that's an overall increase. By next September, essentially by September of 2026, we will have had an increase of 8,775 special needs assistants in our schools. That's a 54% increase. Now, that is by any yardstick a fairly dramatic increase and substantial one. Now, yes, I would, of course, parallel with that, needs have increased. challenges have increased in our schools also. The deployment, and there should be regular reviews always to make sure that we're targeting and also, to the children most in need, and the children most in need get the optimal services. The idea that there would be no reviews, I'm sure you're not suggesting there should never be a review. Yeah, well, I know, I just make the point. I presume you didn't, and that's what I'm saying. Which I think then, if you accept there's reviews, well, reviews can work both ways because of changing need. So a lot of schools get increases when those reviews. I think the mistake made here is that there hasn't been a comprehensive review for quite a number of years. And the NCAC, in endeavouring to correct that in 1 year, in my view, is not the correct approach. And that's why it has been paused. We will ensure in that the Minister is going to engage with the NCAC, obviously, our officials, and both Minister Hildegard-Naughton and Minister Moynihan, but also then we will engage with the schools. Many of those have already appealed, as they do, and we will try and resolve these issues with the schools on an ongoing basis.
Well, Taoiseach, with respect, your response missed the point. We're not disagreeing on the big picture of funding. We're not disagreeing with you that, of course, reviews have to be carried out, but it's how a review is carried out, and it's how it impacts on individual schools. And it's no comfort to the principals who've received letters telling them about a cut, and it is a cut, effectively, in their individual schools. It's no comfort to them to hear you speak about the macro and about the overarching numbers. Because what we have not seen with the way in which you've carried out this review is any appreciation of the destabilising effect that the removal of SNAs from mainstream classes has for those classes and for those school communities. What we don't have after yesterday's announcement is any clarity on what this means in practice. What does it mean for redeployment of SNAs? What does it mean for schools that got letters saying they were going to get an increase in SNA allocations? So we need clarity, Taoiseach, and that's what we're looking for. And of course reviews have to be carried out, but they must be done in a respectful manner and a phased, incremental manner. So Taoiseach, principals do not get a shock letter saying you're going to have a halving of your SNA allocation next year without any prior warning.
Obviously,